Welcome back to Reformed Thinking. Today we're taking on a linguistic and theological puzzle that sits right at the heart of how we understand Scripture.
We really are.
It's this. How did the Hebrew word for throwing or, shooting an arrow become the definitive term for divine instruction, the Torah?
It's quite a journey. We're going to be investigating the surprising semantic path of the root year and, of course, its most famous derivative, the noun tôrâ.
So our mission today is really to trace that path.
Exactly. We need to see how scholars have tried to manage the linguistic acrobatics required to get from the very concrete physical action of casting a lot or hurling a stone,
Right.
all the way to the abstract authority of God's moral direction.
And that tension is just enormous. I mean, when you look at the basic definitions, physical force, military action, projecting something, and then you try to connect that to ethical guidance, they just feel worlds apart.
They do.
The conceptual bridge between throwing a missile and giving the law isn't obvious at all. And this isn't some minor point of grammar. For scholars, this distance between the meanings is a huge linguistic problem that really demands a solid explanation.
It does.
We need to figure out what that proposed link is that spans the gap between physical aim and, spiritual teaching.
Okay, so to even start talking about that link, we first have to appreciate just how big the problem is. Scholars don't even treat Yarah as one word. Traditionally, they break it down into three distinct, separate roots.
So it's not one simple word with a few meanings. It's more like a cluster of ideas that just happen to share the same spelling.
That's a great way to put it. And for you, the listener, understanding these separate buckets of meaning is the real starting point.
A scholar back in the 19th century, Bruhl, he's the one who really formalized this distinction, right?
He did. He laid out three separate semantic domains where this root operates.
Yeah.
And we have to look at all three to really get why the task of unifying them is so difficult.
Okay, so let's start with root I. This one is the most tangible, you said. It's all about physical acts.
Right. Root I operates strictly in the physical world of action and projection. Its core meaning is to throw, cast, or hurl.
And the Old Testament has some pretty powerful examples of this.
Oh, absolutely. In Exodus 15, it's the word used to describe God hurling the Egyptian chariots and their army into the sea. It's about destructive, powerful movement.
But it's also used for things that aren't about destruction, more about setting things in order, foundational rituals.
Exactly. The practice of casting lots, the Gorah, to divide the land among the tribes in Joshua 18, that also uses root I. The lot is physically thrown down to determine a division or a fate.
And then, of course, there's the one everyone thinks of, the military sense, the projectile.
That's the other major physical use, to shoot. This is the sense directly tied to archers shooting arrows or other missiles. The participle form, Yarah, can even mean archer in a military context, like in 1 Chronicles.
And that's a key detail, isn't it? The idea of an arrow.
It's critical because it introduces the concept of an aimed, linear trajectory, a directed path toward a specific target. So whether it's a lot or an arrow, root I is about directed physical movement.
Okay, but then root I has this third application that seems, at least at first, to completely contradict hurling or shooting. It's about permanence.
And that's the most profound tension even within root I. The third physical sense is to lay, set up, or found.
So like setting up a monument.
Precisely. It's used for establishing things, like setting up a memorial pillar, or that heap of witness stones that Jacob and Laban made in Genesis. And the linguistic question here is just startling. How does the same verb that means to hurl something volatile also describe the ultimate act of permanence?
And the most dramatic example of that is in the creation accounts.
It really is. The verb is used to describe God's own foundational act of laying the cornerstone, the even pinah, of the earth itself in Job 38. So yeah, root I runs the whole gamut, from the violent quick movement of a chariot in the sea to the eternal fixed foundation of the cosmos. That alone suggests there's a deep underlying concept here of directed action, or setting a fixed boundary.
All right, so that's the complex world of root 1. Now we have to pivot completely to root 2, which is all about the weather, specifically water.
Yes, root 2 handles the meteorological sense, to water, or to moisten. It's purely about the provision of water, usually rain, and it often shows up in the Hatzel stem.
The causative form.
Right, to cause rain to come upon.
But this isn't just any rain. It has a very specific agricultural and time-based meaning.
It does. This root gives us two specialized nouns, yuker and mura, which don't just mean rain, they specifically mean the early rain. This is the rain that falls in late autumn, October to December, and it's essential for softening the ground for plowing and planting. It starts the whole growing season.
And it's set apart from the later rain, the spring rain.
Exactly, that's the Malkush. So the Bible makes a clear distinction.
Okay, and this is where the linguistic arguments really start to heat up, because not all scholars agree that root 2 is its own separate thing.
That's right. The ambiguity comes up because, scholars generally don't like when a single root has wildly different meanings that you can't easily connect. So some try to force root 2 back into root 1.
How do they do that?
They argue that the rain is like thrown water or scattered drops, viewing the rain as a kind of projectile aimed by God from the heavens.
But then there's an even more radical idea, which is to just get rid of root 2 altogether.
It is a radical move. It's called textual emendation, and it suggests that maybe the texts we have are slightly corrupted.
So they're saying a scribe might have made a mistake.
Essentially. Their reasoning is that irio for rain could have been confused with other, clearer Hebrew roots for rain or pouring. So in some poetic texts, they might propose changing the word to something like zara, which means to scatter or sow, arguing the original meaning was closer to that.
It sounds like they just want things to be tidier linguistically.
That's a big part of it. They'd rather work with 2 roots throwing and teaching that might be connected than 3 that seem totally disconnected. But of course, changing the received text is always a very, very controversial thing to do.
So we've got the very broad root I for throwing and founding, and the contested root 2 for rain, which finally brings us to root 3, the whole reason for this deep dive, which seems completely divorced from both of them.
It does. Root 3 is the abstract root to instruct, teach, give guidance, or direct. This is the conceptual one.
And you said this is almost always in the hemiphil stem.
Almost exclusively. That causative form, meaning to cause someone to know or to cause someone to take a direction. And this, of course, is the root that gives us that monumental noun, tôrâ. Direction, instruction, law.
And this is where the challenge really crystallizes for you, the learner. How do we get from the raw physicality of root I throwing rocks and founding mountains to the ethical and theological world of root 3 providing divine instruction? The distance feels vast. We have to find a solid semantic bridge.
And that transition from root 1 throw shoot to root 3 instruct is the absolute central question. We're looking for what's called an internal derivation, a point where the physical action just naturally morphed into the abstract idea, all within the Hebrew language itself.
And scholars have poured a ton of energy into this, right? They didn't want to just accept that it was a coincidence, that 2 different words were spelled the same way.
Not at all. And the consensus now leans very heavily toward what's called the pointing out theory. It was championed by early scholars like Cassinius and really confirmed by later work.
So what's the mechanism? How does this theory work? It doesn't just jump from a thrown stone to moral law.
No, it finds a specific intermediate physical act that is inherently directional. It zeroes in on that linear quality of root, the aiming.
Like aiming an arrow.
Exactly. When you shoot an arrow, you're aiming it along a fixed path to a goal.
Huh.
The theory suggests that the teaching sense developed from the physical act of extending the hand or the finger in order to indicate the way. Instruction is a metaphorical extension of that aiming or pointing.
That makes the semantic leap feel much smaller. The shared concept is directionality. An archer directs a missile. A teacher directs a student's path.
Precisely. And what really sells this theory is the usage in the Heisfil stem. Remember, Heisfil means to cause to aim. But that aiming doesn't have to be with a projectile. If I cause you to aim your body along a path, I'm directing you. If I cause you to aim your life toward righteousness, I'm instructing you. It keeps that core idea of aiming for a goal.
And there's actual evidence in the text that shows this intermediate step, the verb being used for just simple physical direction.
Yes, Genesis 46.28 is a critical verse. Jacob sends Judah ahead of him to point out before him the way to Goshen. The verb used is the hiskil of yor. Judah isn't casting a lot. He's not delivering a sermon. He's just physically showing the path. It's the most straightforward use of pointing the way.
And Proverbs gives us the definitive link between that physical pointing and the more ethical kind of teaching.
It really does. It's through nonverbal signaling. Proverbs 6 talks about a deceitful person, and it says he points out with his fingers. The root were is applied to a physical nonverbal signal pointing a finger that conveys meaning or direction.
In this case, malicious direction.
Right, but it locks in that linguistic connection. You have a simple physical signal that is giving abstract direction. So the action of the archer, the pointing of the finger, the word of the teacher, they all share that same directed intent.
Now, before we fully accept the pointing out theory, we should probably touch on the alternative that was popular for a while, the one that used a more specific cultic practice, the casting lots thesis.
Ah, yes. That was proposed by Wellhausen, most famously. He tried to link root I and root 3 by focusing specifically on the ritual of casting lots.
So the logic was what?
The rationale was that since casting lots provided an authoritative oracle, a direction, a tôrâ, then the act of casting itself, root 1, became synonymous with the instruction that resulted from it, root 3.
But scholars have mostly moved on from that idea. What was its weakness?
It's just too specific. It's too narrow to explain the incredible breadth of what tôrâ comes to mean. Tôrâ is parental guidance, it's wisdom, it's detailed ritual codes, it's the entire national covenant. Trying to derive all of that from one single, specialized cultic ritual, it feels forced.
Whereas pointing out, based on the universal idea of aimed direction, just works better.
It offers a far more satisfying and broad explanation for how the word evolved.
Okay, so the pointing out theory is strong, but with ancient languages, you can never just close the book. The linguistic distance between throwing and teaching is just so wide that scholars always have to consider outside influences. Could it be that the instructional root Yarah third didn't evolve from the Hebrew jur at all, but came in as a loanword?
And that's a necessary question.
Yeah.
It forces us to look at the neighboring dominant languages of the ancient Near East, especially Akkadian. Akkadian was the lingua franca of the region for a long, long time.
So if the Hebrew word for instruction sounds like an Akkadian word for guidance, we have to take that possibility seriously.
We do. And the first Akkadian option involves the verbal root, WRO.
Okay, what's the theory here?
Well, if you start with the assumption that the Hebrew throwing root and the instructing root are completely separate, then the instructional one could have come from the Akkadian WRO, which means to lead or to guide.
That's a very clean semantic fit.
It is. It's not the most popular theory today, but it's still linguistically viable. Even the scholars who favor the internal derivation admit they are unable to exclude this option. It provides a legitimate, separate etymology that doesn't rely on throwing or pointing at all.
But the second Akkadian possibility is even more significant because it flips the whole linguistic process on its head. It suggests the noun tôrâ itself might have been borrowed first.
This involves the Akkadian noun têrtu. Têrtu was a common, well-established word in Akkadian that meant portent, omen, or instruction.
So an authoritative direction from a divine source.
Exactly. A perfect semantic match for the Hebrew Torah.
And why would Hebrew borrow this noun?
Well, during certain periods of Israel's history, like the monarchy and the exile, Akkadian influence was just immense, politically, culturally. Borrowing specialized administrative or religious terms was very common. So if têrtu already carried this weight of being an authoritative, divinely sourced instruction, it makes perfect sense that Hebrew speakers would adopt it.
Okay, but if the noun tôrâ was borrowed, how does that completely change our view of the Hebrew verb, the hapol of ur that means to instruct?
It reverses the linguistic flow. It's a process called denomination. Normally, you expect the verb to come first. The action of instructing, here, generates the noun instruction, tôrâ.
Right.
But if tôrâ was borrowed from Akkadian, the process is inverted. The noun tôrâ establishes itself in Hebrew, and then Hebrew speakers derive a new verb, ur, from that borrowed noun to mean to give Torah.
That is a staggering reversal. It would mean that the aiming sense and the instruction sense are just homonyms spelled the same by pure chance.
Exactly. And the instructional root was just created from a foreign noun. It completely removes the need for that internal pointing out bridge. And this possibility that the noun came first and then generated its own verb is a powerful argument.
The sources say it deserves discussion.
It certainly does, because it explains the huge semantic gap by arguing that the instructional meaning never had to evolve from throwing in the first place. It just arrived, fully formed, as a borrowed concept.
So whether the bridge was built internally from the simple act of pointing a finger, or whether the concept was imported from outside, the end result is the same. The hifel of ur became firmly established as the word for to instruct.
Right. And now that we've dealt with the etymology, we can look at the massive scope of direction that here covers. And this instruction wasn't just limited to the moral code of the covenant. It covered every part of life where you needed authoritative direction.
Let's start with the very practical technical uses. It feels a little strange to use the same word for teaching morality and for teaching a craft.
It really shows that your hitfil, at its core, means authoritative supervision or direction toward a specific skill. The sources point to the instruction given to Bezalel for the craftsmanship of the tabernacle.
In Exodus.
Yes, Exodus 35 uses Yarah to describe God giving Bezalel the ability and the instruction for all these cultic and technical matters, weaving, carving, metalwork. This isn't moral law, it's direction and vocational excellence.
That's a fascinating thought for those of us who really appreciate the doctrine of vocation. It means that divine direction, lisol, isn't just for ethical living, but for the skillful execution of physical, technical work.
Precisely. It breaks down that neat little line we often draw between the sacred and the secular. Any worthwhile directed action, whether you're building an ark or following a commandment, falls under the scope of your head.
Okay, now moving into the wisdom tradition, like in Proverbs.
Mhm.
There, Tôrâ takes on a much more relational and ethical feel, separate from state law.
It does. In wisdom literature, Tôrâ is understood in a hokmatic sense, related to wisdom, not a nomistic or legal sense. Here, Tôrâ refers to human instruction, often put in parallel with words like okma, wisdom, and musar, admonition. It's about shaping character. The instruction of the wise is called a well of life in Proverbs 13.
And this context really brings the family unit to the forefront. Some scholars even think this might be the ultimate origin of the whole concept.
The authority within the family is central. Tôrâ is the instruction of a father to a son, but the sources highlight something really unique here. The designation of the instruction of the mother, also called tôrâ in Proverbs 1 and 6.
In a culture that was so often dominated by patriarchal legal structures, that's huge. The mother is explicitly given the authority to impart Tôrâ.
It is huge. And it's crucial because it might be the most fundamental, the earliest form of authoritative direction a person ever receives. Before there was a priest giving ritual codes or a king enforcing written law, there was a parent guiding a child.
So that initial, intimate, domestic direction provides the basic concept for life-shaping guidance.
That could then be scaled up later to the nation, the prophet, and finally to God himself.
And this familial instruction is all about its oral quality. It's spoken, it's immediate.
It's intensely relational and oral. It's direct command, exhortation. The text often says to hear the instruction. Even in marriage, the capable wife in Proverbs 31 is praised because the kind instruction, the Tôrâ East, is on her tongue. It's a living, spoken word that shapes daily life.
So that brings us to the unsettling side of this. If ear means authoritative direction, that authority can be corrupted. It can lead to false teaching.
This is where the root shows its vulnerability. The hate-filled participle mure, which means teacher or instructor, can be combined with iker, which means lie or falsehood. That gives you the phrase mure shakre, the lying teacher.
An instructor who is fundamentally aimed in the wrong direction.
Perfectly put, leading to sin and error.
And the places we see this phrase are powerful critiques aimed at both human and even non-human authority figures.
We see it first used to describe a prophet giving false instruction in Isaiah 9. That's a clear critique of a religious leader misusing his platform. But the use in Habakkuk 2 is maybe the most arresting. There, the phrase is applied to a metallic idol, a mesai.
So a manufactured statue, a piece of metal, is being called a lying teacher, using the same theological language you'd apply to Moses or a priest.
Yes, it's a profound statement about where people seek authority. In the Israelite mindset, Shing covered anything that claimed to give authoritative direction. If people turned to an idol for an oracle, then that idol was, by definition, an instructor.
And since it wasn't God, its instruction was false.
It was cheaker. It's a deliberate theological counterpoint, stressing that while the authority to give direction exists, only the true God provides direction that leads to life.
Okay, we've seen Tôrâ applied to craft, to family, to wisdom. Now we get to its most familiar and, well, climactic use. Tôrâ as divine instruction, as law. But this didn't just appear as one unified book. It grew out of two separate, influential historical traditions that saw God's authority differently: the priestly tradition and the Deuteronomic tradition.
And this historical divergence is so important because it shows that the meaning of Tôrâ was dynamic. These two traditions, which we call P and DTR, they operated at the same time and eventually fused together to give us our final understanding of the Pentateuch.
So let's start with the priestly, or P, usage.
Yep.
How did the priests think about and communicate Tôrâ?
The priestly tradition saw Tôrâ not as a single constitution, but as individual, specific cultic directions. It was an atomized, detailed, case-by-case approach.
Which is why we see the plural form, Tôrâ, laws, so often in priestly texts.
Exactly. It refers to multiple distinct rules about specific rituals, sacrifices, or matters of purity.
And the priest was the source of all this instruction.
He was. Communicating Torah was an essential, non-negotiable duty of the priesthood. The priest was the living oracle, instructing the layperson on proper ritual and how to manage that boundary between the sacred and the profane. The sources are clear. If you didn't have a teaching priest, a Kujay Mor, you didn't have Torah.
And what was the central theme of this priestly Torah? What was the definitive direction they were supposed to give?
Their core function was taxonomy defining boundaries. The priests instructed the people on the difference between holy and profane, and between clean and unclean. This defined everything: how people interacted with the tabernacle, what they could eat, how they could live without contaminating God's presence. It required constant, specific instruction.
So the priestly Torah was fundamentally about ritual status and separation, and started out as oral direction, right? Delivered on demand.
That's right. It was originally an oral tradition. A person would come to the priest with a question, is this sacrifice clean? And the priest would give a ruling. They were eventually written down, but the literary form usually keeps that specific rule-based structure. You see formulas like, this is the Torah, the grain offering, or this is the Torah for leprosy.
Okay, so now let's make a dramatic shift to the Deuteronomic or DTR usage. Here we go from case-by-case ritual rulings to something like a unified public national constitution.
That's a great way to describe it. The Deuteronomic tradition came from a more prophetic viewpoint, which argued that God's will isn't a collection of separate rules, but a holistic unity, a single covenant. Torah, in DTR, is a single comprehensive body of law for the whole nation.
And the authority for this unified law shifted from the priest, the great historical figure of the covenant,
To Moses. The DTR concept is tied directly to Moses. It's often called the Torah of Moses. This sits the instruction within the historical story of the covenant at Horeb, or Sinai. Moses is the unique, singular mediator who delivers the entire scope of God's will to the nation.
And this focus on unity meant it had to become a fixed, written document, which is a huge departure from the priestly oral rulings.
A major departure. The DTR literature constantly stresses that the Torah is a fixed, authoritative written text. You see phrases like this Torah, or very specifically, the book of this Torah. This written document was meant to be the unchanging standard against which the entire life of the nation, the kings, the judges, the people, was to be measured.
And it included everything, not just laws, but judgments and curses.
All of it. The statutes, the hukim, the judgments, the michatim, and the detailed curse sanctions of the covenant were all part of this one book.
So to contrast them, P is about ritual taxonomy, atomized rules orally given by the priest. DTR is about a unified national covenant, centrally given by Moses and fixed in writing. How did these two concepts ever come together into the one Torah we think of today?
Well, the DTR concept ended up being the more dominant force, both politically and theologically, in shaping the final canon. The rediscovery of the Book of the Torah of Moses during Josiah's reign gave the nation a unified written source for renewal.
So that concept of a single written document was able to absorb the other traditions.
It was. It created a framework that could incorporate all the specific priestly elements, the rules of sacrifice, the ritual codes, while framing them within that larger, unified covenantal story.
And this codified written Torah eventually gained a status of timeless validity.
It became the self-attesting source of truth. By the time you get to post-exilic Judaism, the entire Pentateuch is being called the Torah. The concept evolved from individual direction, whether from a parent or a priest, to a national constitution in Deuteronomy, and finally to becoming synonymous with the most authoritative written revelation of God, the foundation for everything that came after.
And it all came from a single root that once described aiming an arrow.
We started with this profound linguistic conflict, throwing versus teaching. We've traced error from its origin and aiming, and we found its conceptual anchor in that simple, physical act of pointing the way, whether by hand or finger. That directional act seems to have provided the semantic bridge that allowed the concept to expand into every kind of authoritative direction.
And the life of that instruction, Torah, shows just how essential authoritative direction is in every area of life. We saw the difference between the priestly Torah, focused on specific ritual boundaries, clean and unclean, and the Deuteronomic Torah, which unified God's direction into a single, written covenantal standard for national righteousness. That tension between specificity and unity is really what defined the final shape of the law. And for you, the listener, what resonates most about the sheer breadth of authority that comes from this one root? We've seen her used for the guidance of a mother to her child, the technical skill given to an artisan like Bezalel, the definitive rulings of a priest, and the overarching constitution given by God through Moses. This one verbal concept really does connect every form of intentional, directed action, from a physical throw to establishing the way of righteousness.
And this brings us right back to the rain, root 2, even with all its linguistic debate. We talked about the Yarah, the instruction of the early rain, which God aims to fall at the start of the season, providing the life-sustaining provision needed for planting. If we entertain that semantic link for a moment, how does that connection between physical provision aimed to sustain life and spiritual guidance, the Tôrâ, aimed to guide life, how does that inform your own concept of divine providence, which directs both the natural world and the moral world toward their appointed goals?